I am unable to tell, but the learning part will endure. And this year, for the Liner Lunch and Learn, which is the name of our class, which was sponsored by Alice and Nachum Liner in years past, and continuing sponsorship for which we are grateful. This year for the class, we're going to do the 7 deadly sins. Now, let me explain that this is not a Jewish concept, but all of the 7 have implications in the Jewish tradition. And since for many years I've had a book on my shelf by Solomon Schimmel, who was he's a professor of psychology and education at Hebrew College in Boston, and a psychologist on the 7 deadly sins in, there you go, there's the book, in Judaism, Christianity, and classical tradition. I thought, oh, that's a nice theme. And I can take the sins, each one in each class, and talk to you about my perspective and the Jewish perspective on those. The sins, by the way, for those of you who need a refresher course, are pride, envy, anger, lust, gluttony, greed. And I'm already tired. I don't want to mention the last one. It's sloth. But today I thought, what better day than election day to do anger? So I'm going to go out of order on this topic, and if there is in fact an order to sin, which might make another class, and talk about anger. And I'm going to talk about it to some extent from the point of view, obviously, of the Jewish tradition, but also just to explain some of what we have learned, or what we think we have learned about anger, and especially on a day in which I expect we will see more of it than we wish, and in the days to come. So anger, in the old phrase, is a form of madness. And the first thing to understand about anger is, and I think that this is true of almost all human impulses, but in some ways, anger even more. When you are angry, you are almost a different person than the person you are when you're calm. People say things in anger and do things in anger that they cannot imagine saying or doing when they're not angry. And that is so much the case that even though we know, and we'll return to this, that if you would just wait, you will feel differently, your anger doesn't allow you to believe it at the time. And when people on impulse of anger say and do things and then later don't understand how they could, it's hard to recreate the grip on our emotions and our cognition, our thoughts, that anger induces. So, a couple of Jewish thoughts on the subject of anger before we talk about it in other ways. First of all, there is a marvelous phrase in the Talmud that there are 3 ways of knowing someone: kiso, koso, and kaaso. Kiso is your pocket, koso is your cup, and kaaso is your anger. Kiso, koso, kaaso. And when it says these are 3 ways of knowing someone, it presumes something. Let me just, I was asked to show the book again for a second, so let me just do that. It's called The 7 Deadly Sins, Solomon Schimmel, and it was published in 1992. I don't think it's still in print, but I may be wrong, but that is the book. Okay. It assumes that what you give in charity, how you act when you're angry, and how you act when you're drunk are part of your true nature. And this is an interesting question, and one I don't think there is a definitive answer to, which is, does anger distort who you are or reveal who you are? Well, one thing that we might say is it certainly can be revealing of things that are true. So you say something angry to someone that you've thought when you're not angry, but would never say. You say something to someone when you're drunk that you have thought when you weren't drunk, but you would never say. And I remember, I remember years ago when speaking to a rabbi about synagogue life. He said, if you want to know what the synagogue cares about, then you do the same thing that you do when you want to know what a person cares about, which is you look at their budget, not what they say they care about, but what they spend their money on. So kiso, koso, and kaaso may in fact be revelatory of who we are, just as the Talmud says. However, it is also true that that measures to combat anger say something about who you are. Who is a strong man? One who combats his anger or is slow to anger, says Ben Zoma in the Talmud, and in one instance of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam, and I'll come back to the Rambam in just a second, says one who becomes angry, it's as though he worshipped idols. In other words, you no longer remember God, you only remember the feeling of your own anger. And Rambam here, who's Maimonides, great Jewish theologian, legal scholar, philosopher, Rambam here does talk about the legitimacy of some anger and the illegitimacy of others. And he says there are certain spiritual truths for which one is permitted to get angry. I wonder if anger is ever beneficial, though, if it's uncontrolled. That is, I can imagine a certain amount of anger that somebody still has hold of themselves that could make a point, that could be useful. But I am not sure that uncontrolled anger or fury is ever a constructive emotion. And it may be an inevitable emotion, but I'm not sure it's a constructive emotion. And one of the reasons that this is a complicated question is because in the Torah, the principal model of anger is God, right? Charon apecha, God's fury and God's wrath is common in the Torah. And so the question is for the rabbis, what does that mean that God gets angry in the Torah? And their answer is that the difference between God's anger and human anger is that God can control anger, but anger controls human beings. So God gets just as angry as is sufficient, presumably, to the purpose. But that's not true with human beings. We can't calibrate anger so easily. This sense has to do with what anger is about and where anger comes from. And here, having thought about the subject for the last while, because obviously I knew I was going to be teaching about it, and also because I've been looking through the sources, like anger can cause a sage to lose his wisdom in the Talmud. In other words, anger can supersede everything, and knowing that we were coming up on the election, and that the election obviously would cause a lot of anger, no matter how it goes. And I tried to figure out what is it that makes us angry? Because every single day, there are things that could make us angry, but they don't. We think of it the other way, as why do you get angry over that? You don't need to, but the opposite is also true. There is no injustice, slight, cruelty that doesn't happen on earth every day, but we don't get angry about it. And then all of a sudden something happens and it infuriates us. And this is the clue that the origin of anger is not actually in the external world, but in the internal world. That if we would understand anger, we must understand ourselves. That there is a part of us that is triggered by certain phenomena, and and as Emerson puts it so well, we all boil at different degrees. That is, that which makes you furious doesn't bother me. That which really bothers me, you slough off as though it's nothing. And therefore, part of the work that we ought to be doing is to understand what it is that makes us angry. Because in this sense, it might be similar to other sins, although we'll have to see as we go through them, because we're going to go through a lot of sins. It is not the anger itself that is the sin as much as what the anger produces, the behavior, and especially the words in most cases in our world that the anger produces. Now, sometimes it's the behavior. Jacob on his deathbed says to Shimon and Levi that he doesn't want to be in their council because of their anger. That is an example. If you remember the story of Dinah, they were furious. They became angry and took vengeance on an entire town for the violation of their sister. But the idea here is not, Jacob is not upset because they felt anger, but because they acted on anger. So there are at least two separate questions when you come to the sin of anger. And then I do want to say, maybe we should have done at the beginning something about the idea of sin. The two questions are, one, how do you understand and control your feelings of anger? And two, how do you control your actions and words from anger? Let me say something about those two and then return to the question of sin in the Jewish context. The first is, sometimes our anger surprises us. That is, every now and then, what happens is we encounter something and surprisingly, it raises anger inside of us that we didn't even know was there. And in such an instance, obviously, you have to figure out why that is. In other situations, we go into a situation knowing that it will anger us. You go to a dinner and there's someone there that you know is going to get you angry, for example. Although these days you probably don't do that, pandemic and all. And here, the only, not cure, but ameliorative, the only thing that will make it a little better is self-knowledge. I know this is going to happen. I know how I normally react to that. If I understand why I react that way, perhaps I can react somewhat differently. The emotion or the reaction says something about who you are or something inside you, which is something I see a comment that Shelley made as well, something inside you that you may not be aware of. That is entirely possible. That happens all the time, especially in raising children. Children will say or do something that you'll react to, and you didn't know that would be something that you would react to, because you tend to relive stages with children of the past that maybe you forgot or buried. But then there is also the age-old advice, which is wise and often not heeded, of counting to 10. And that is, everybody knows that anger is to some extent a transitive state. It changes. Almost no one is angry all the time, right? Almost no one. I'm sure there are people who are angry all the time, but almost no one is angry all the time. And therefore, when in the grip of anger, what strategies can you employ to make sure that you don't act in that moment? Because most of the time you will still be able to act if you decide not to later. If you decide to later. That is, let's say somebody angers you by an email they send. You can write them back tomorrow. You can write the angry email and not put a name in the response and then decide so that it does get accidentally sent. This is a trick I assume you all know, which is a useful one to know. That is, you write the angry email, but you don't put the name of the sender in it so that you don't accidentally send it. And then the next day you look over the draft and you see the things that you still want to say or don't say, and you're grateful that you gave yourself a night to sleep on it. But the endless loop that runs in your head when something angers you should in itself be a signal that this is touching things that I'm not entirely aware of about me. And therefore I need to give it some time till I understand it better, or I'm no longer in the grip of this, because as Maimonides says, it's like worshiping a false god because it controls you. Now, let me say something about sin, which I should probably have started with, but I didn't. So you will sometimes hear from rabbis that sin in Judaism is really about missing the mark, because chet is an archery term, and it comes from missing the mark. In other words, you don't quite get it right. But it does not have the overwhelming sort of sense of depravity that the word sin does in English. I'm here sadly and realistically, and I suppose happily, to tell you that that's not really true. That's true about chet, but chet is not the only word for sin in the Jewish tradition. There is pesha, there's avon, there are lots of words for sin. And that's because in Judaism, sin is a serious thing. And the whole structure of the tradition is built on the assumption that people are free agents and therefore can do what they choose, and sometimes choose to do right and sometimes choose to do wrong. The Greek, really the Socratic idea that if you just knew what the totality of the situation was, you would always do the right thing, is not exactly in accord with the Jewish assumption about human anthropology, which is that all human beings have good and evil inclinations, and sometimes from the force of it, and sometimes almost willingly, we give in to evil inclinations. And that reality is something that you have to come to grips with if you're going to deal with human beings. And therefore, anger, which is something that is not meditated, someone doesn't say, unlike, I don't know, unlike giving to charity or not giving to charity, anger isn't something that you in advance say, you know, I think that I'm going to be angry now, and make a conscious decision. Because part of the pathology of anger is that it's not voluntary, that it happens to you, that it grips you, and therefore what you do in advance of the anger in some ways is the quality of your moral life, how you try to head it off, how you try to deal with it, how you try to change yourself in order to become better, as opposed to being an angry person. Now, I can't talk about all of this without just saying a word about where we are today. And I'm going to invite you to ask questions or make comments because I'm wrapping up the soliloquy in the next couple of minutes. I don't have to tell you um, how angry and divisive uh, American society has become um, over the past number of years. And what started it and what accelerates it are not our concern for the moment, but that it has become the emotional tenor of public discourse and our discourse with each other has become uglier is beyond doubt. I don't want to say anything like it's uglier than it has ever been, because those sort of statements are always subject to the corrections of history. And we tend to forget what terrible things people said to each other in the past. And we think, oh, we're the first ones that have said terrible things to each other. Trust me, we are not. There is nothing that you could say that has not been said to other people in one way or another, and often much worse than the public discourse today. Having said that, however, we are certainly worse than we have been for a long, long time. And therefore, we have to be aware of the fact that at the end of the day, or the end of tomorrow, or the end of a few weeks, I don't know when, sooner obviously would be better, that some 40 to 45% or more of our fellow citizens are going to be bitterly disappointed. And many of them will be angry on both sides. Well, on one side at the end of it, but I'm talking about if it goes this way on that side, if it goes that way on this side. And therefore, those who will feel angry will have an important moral decision to make, which is how they will express their anger in a way that will make the country better as opposed to worse. Because if you support a candidate in order to make the country better, then presumably when that candidate loses, you don't want to all of a sudden make the country worse. That will be the challenge and the question. Now, it's also true, I want to say, since we're in the grip of this, and I don't want to pretend this class is not for the ages, this class is for today, it is also true that those who win have a moral choice to make, which is how you express your joy or relief or whatever it is you feel, and do you do it in a way that is bound to antagonize those who feel other than you do? In other words, do you gloat? Do you spike the football? Do you say, well, I'm glad that no good so-and-so went down to defeat? Because if so, you will evoke the anger of the other side. And that's why anger is going to play such a big role in either being induced or suppressed or taking over the public discourse or being calmed in the public discourse. And certainly we hope that it will be calmed, especially in such an incendiary atmosphere. Okay, so there we have sin, we have anger, we have the results of anger. Now let me ask you if you have any questions or comments about that, and if you do, please put them on wherever, on Facebook, on YouTube, on wherever it is that you're watching, and I will do my best to address them. Okay, so one question is there any kind of unique teaching of like ways that Judaism has of making anger less palpable? And I would say yes, there is, which is, first of all, amazingly, the practice of generosity helps make anger less palpable. because it is very hard to hold two cups at once. And when you act kindly to somebody that you're angry at, it changes the nature of the relationship. And that that kind of gesture and that kind of action does in fact help to ameliorate anger. We know that Judaism teaches often that, unlike the normal or the conventional wisdom that your actions follow your emotions, that your emotions often follow your actions. It's called the James Lang theory of emotions in psychology, but in Judaism, it's just called, I guess, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, that you do things originally not for the right reason, but the reason follows the doing. So sometimes if there's somebody that you're angry at and you're kind to them, even though it goes against your instinct, it helps build that kind of bond and bridge that makes you less angry. So those of you who will see that, who read Off the Pulpit or my Times of Israel column, will see that I talk about this in the context. It comes out, I think, tonight or tomorrow. I talk about this in the context of Abraham and Lot, which was also my sermon this past Shabbat, that Lot and Abraham's herdsmen had quarrels. And what did Abraham do? He said to Lot, "You take whatever area you want, and I'll take the rest. You go north, I'll go south. You go east, I'll go west." And that was a way of Abraham not only settling the quarrel, but showing by his own generosity that anger wouldn't be the controlling emotion of his existence, even though he had every reason to have a good grudge against Lot, who, after all, he brought out of Ur Kasdim when God called on Abraham to go, but he took Lot with him. So I saw that Lynn quotes Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was famous for this, right? Lincoln was extraordinarily gifted in being able to look past his own personal grudges. And here it goes to the question of disinterest. One of you, Luciana, talks about distance, and it is the disinterestedness of and the distancing from the source of anger that often enables you to get over it, sort of the eagle's eye view. You see the situation not from your immediate emotional reaction, but from a place of some distance, which is why you can, if you can count to 10, right, you're giving yourself distance. If you can sleep on it, you're giving yourself distance. Some people are better or have mastered the ability to give themselves distance almost immediately. That is, something happens, and instead of getting angry, they observe their own reaction. They say, I see myself getting angry at this. I wonder why I'm getting angry at this. And therefore, instead of being reactive, they observe. And anger itself is not, I saw that Miriam asked if it's equivalent to sinat chinam. Not really. Sinat chinam is baseless hatred. Anger is not necessarily hatred. In fact, quite the opposite. My guess is most people get angry most often at the people they're closest to, not the people they hate. And that's because the people that you're closest to are the people who have the greatest grip on your emotions. And they're the people that you identify with most. That's why when you're a kid, your parents can embarrass you, but other people's parents don't embarrass you, right? Other people's parents do something, you go, I don't care. Your own parents do anything, and it's embarrassing. Because it's what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. When you identify with someone, but you don't identify with them completely. I mean, let's take the Jewish community. Why are Jews upset that other Jews support the candidate of the other side? Because they identify with them as Jews. Someone else supports that candidate, okay. but that somebody that you have an identity with should do something that is so other than what you would do, that is painful. And this gives us at least part of the key to why we get angry, because it touches something deep in our ego, right? Either I'm like you, but unlike you in this crucial way, and therefore we're a little wounded, or more often I attack you in some way, which is even more wounding. And so there are these triggers that we're not entirely aware of, that that move us to anger, and sometimes in ways that we're not conscious of, and then we have to try to figure out how to undo it. So it isn't exactly. I don't think you make tshuva for being angry. That is, you don't have to repent for your anger. What you repent for are not your emotions as much as your actions. You repent for saying something that you ought not to have said. You repent for doing something that you ought not to have done. In other words, penitence is about the way in which you put your energy out into the world. But in fact, if you get angry and don't do something, that's praiseworthy, as opposed to something that you need to do tshuva for. Now, it depends also on what madrega, what step on the ladder you hope to reach. Because there have been people in our tradition who, there's a famous story about Hillel in the Talmud, where someone tried to get him to be angry and did not succeed. That level of spiritual attainment, such that someone can't even get you angry, is, I suppose, possible to a great extent, maybe not a complete extent, but there are certainly people who have worked on their reactivity, their anger, and have gotten better at it. And there are people, obviously, who don't get angry as easily, and they're lucky. Now, I think what I just saw Katrina say is absolutely true, which is that our interactions with social media contribute to the hostility of the general atmosphere in some significant ways. I recommend to you, I've mentioned it before in other contexts, but I recommend to you The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which talks about how algorithms control what we see and hear on social media and reinforce our preconceptions and move us into other areas that we would otherwise not have moved to, on the assumption that if you like this, you're going to like this. Not as crude as your Netflix, if you like this show, you'll like this show, but much more subtle. And as Yuval Harari says, it's quoted in the story, these algorithms know us better than we know ourselves, because they've spent billions of dollars examining people's interests and what their interests lead them to. And therefore, if you are, you should excuse the term, a rageaholic, if there's somebody who likes to get angry, it will feed you stuff that will get you angry. And if you like to argue against something, it will feed you stuff that will enable you to argue against it. And so we are, to some extent, made more what we are, more polarized. And by the way, a fascinating study that was brought to my attention not so long ago is that the usual solution to this, the easy solution, which is you should watch what the other guys say, doesn't work. Not so easily. That when they took viewers from Fox and had them watch MSNBC, or viewers from MSNBC and had them watch Fox, it reinforced the preconceptions that they brought already to the table. Because these are deep structures in us for the most part. And they've been reinforced for a long time, and a simple exposure to someone else is not going to all of a sudden change our minds. And so as you see, anger leads you, as I suppose every sin does, deeper and deeper and deeper into the human dilemma. and human character. And you do wonder, what's the way out? So I don't have a magic pill any more than any of you do. But I do know that we have mentioned along the way, and I want to sort of codify some of them, a couple of the characteristics and the ideas that enable us at least to deal better with the dilemma of anger and kindred emotions, things that are similar to it. And one is recognizing that the way you feel at any moment is not permanent. There is hardly a more important lesson to teach children and to teach ourselves than that lesson. Emerson, again, whom I quoted earlier, said, "My moods don't believe each other." Like, when you're in one mood, it's really hard to imagine what it's like to be in another mood. And knowing that, I mean, really deeply knowing that, taking that in and absorbing it, enables you to be able to feel something and sit with it as opposed to react to it. That's tremendously important. It is remarkable how much a day can change your outlook on something that infuriates you. And our ability today to tweet, to write something on your Facebook page, to Snapchat, in other words, to put out there all of a sudden our instant reactions to things is, I think, not a mode that is conducive to the calming of anger. How many times have people made public statements and then wished they had not? Or as the Spanish proverb has it, a fly does not enter a closed mouth. So there is first of all time crucial in trying to be a successful person. And then there is the ability to step back from oneself and to look with some disinterest at situations and at other people. If you do that, one of the things that you almost invariably recognize is that the thing that someone else said or did, you have said and done too. You know, Kohelet caught this thousands of years ago. He said, "Don't be upset when you hear your servant revile you in your own home. How often have you done that?" And you realize you might be upset that your friend says something negative about you, but how often have you said negative things about your friends behind their backs? Or thought them, even if you haven't said them? And when you realize the universality of the thing that angers you, if you're capable of that breadth of view, that also can help calm you. I mean, the example that I've given many times, but unfortunately continues to be true, is when I'm driving and someone cuts me off and I get furious. How could you do that to me? And then I remember there have been times I've cut other people off, deliberately or not. I know I have. And so why am I acting as though this person has no warrant to be walking on God's earth because they cut me off when I've done the same thing? And how often is the case that we get infuriated for things that we ourselves have done? If you don't know the answer to that, let me give you the answer. A lot. So disinterest, time, and I think also just awareness. Awareness not only of others, but awareness of oneself. What is it in me that makes me angry? And why does it make me angry? The better you know yourself, the better you deal with almost any any situation, but certainly the better you deal with anger, because it's one of those involuntary expressions of character that it's very hard to help. Okay, other questions or comments about anger or anything related to it that I can respond to or help with. There are, at least a few observations about God's anger in the Torah that the rabbis make, which are not only that God controls anger, but anger controls human beings. But also remember, when the Torah talks about God feeling angry or whatever, the rabbis always remind us, Torah dibra b'lshon b'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in human terms. And it's not like God really gets angry. That's ascribing a human emotion to something that is beyond human comprehension. But we don't have a better word to use to reflect whatever action we see in the Torah. So that also reminds us how often we can't even see into the souls of one another, right? You look like you're angry, but I can't entirely know what goes on inside of you. And also, even if I do see you're angry, I don't know what experiences you've had in your past or even recently that are triggering that as much as they are. I just hope, as I know you do, that especially today, anger will be at a minimum as we move into this final post-election season, and that the disappointment that will inevitably be felt by one side or another, and the recriminations that will inevitably be felt by one side or another will not express themselves in the kind of public anger that is destructive and divisive, and that tends to tear people and nations apart. Because one of the things that we have to remember is that things seem like they're very solid until they start to fall apart. And we have to be careful about that. Have to be careful. It's like Hemingway's beautiful line about how somebody goes bankrupt. He says, first gradually, then all at once. And nations can come apart first gradually and then all at once. And one of the solvents of nationhood is anger. And one of the binding forces is kindness and goodness. So even if you see other people being angry over the next several days, I hope that you will be able to respond to that anger with kindness. Remember that in the end, you don't look weaker, you look stronger. Somebody who hears anger and responds to it kindly, that is not weakness. That's tremendous strength. Anger is not strength, even though it can superficially seem that way. So, if you think about it, the person who was standing against the tank at Tiananmen Square was much stronger than the driver of the tank. And with that, what can I tell you? I know that we will be talking much more about this subject in the days and weeks and months ahead. And I know that anger is not going away. It is as old as human beings. But every gesture we make in the direction of calm, not of acceptance always, You can be passionate and oppositional and serious without letting your anger lead you to say things that you would later regret, without diminishing others' humanity, without using names. You can do all of that. And if we do that, we'll be okay. We will be okay. I think we'll be okay anyway. I'm fundamentally hopeful. After all, God and history are big things. And it is certainly true that at every moment human beings tend to exaggerate the importance of the instant in which they live. But you got to take a bigger view, and a kinder one. So with that, since I see no other questions at the moment, I'm going to suggest that you join us again next time. And Thursday morning, please join me at 9 o'clock for the Torah class. We will be discussing the Parsha of Vayera, and by then we'll know a lot more than we know now. The other sins are pride, envy, lust, gluttony, greed, and sloth. I'm not sure which one I'll pick next, but we'll see. One of them. In the meantime, I wish you strength. I wish you peace. And God bless America.